Good evening. I hope everyone's had enough food. I made sure I filled up my plate before I left the table. See Bill's back there ready to get the leftovers. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight for this special heritage presentation. I want to thank Admiral Hogg for coming, Admiral Gunn, good to see you, and we're honored to have Rear Admiral Toole, former commander of River Division 53 with us tonight, which is part of the story. Dr. Esmeralda and Commander Davitt here. It's going to be a very interesting evening, and we're glad you all could be here. Tonight, Dr. Sherwood is going to monitor and run this discussion. He's a historian from the Naval Historical and Heritage and Command and the author of War in the Shallows, U.S. Navy Coastal and Riverine Warfare in Vietnam, 1965 to 1968. He's also on the committee at SNA and has been working with us all year to put this together, as well as last year's program, which was phase one of the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of Vietnam. I'd also like to thank Dr. Winkler for showing up tonight, who's worked with us for years and helped put this together. So without further ado, I'd like to present Dr. Sherwood. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, Captain Chester Smith will not be with us tonight. I will be providing some insight into his career in Vietnam instead. But our first speaker tonight is Esmeralda, Dr. Esmeralda. Our second speaker is Commander Fred McDavitt. Dr. Esmeralda had a 40-year career in the federal government. His last position was Director of Naval History, Acting, and Senior Historian of the U.S. Navy. He has authored, co-authored, or edited 15 books, including From Military Assistance to Combat, 1959-1965, in the Vietnam series of the Naval History and Heritage Command. He is also the author of By Sea, Air, and Land, an Illustrated History of the United States Navy, and Ready Sea Power, a History of the U.S. 7th Fleet. Currently, he is overseeing a commemorative booklet series on the U.S. Navy in the Vietnam War and has authored or co-authored 4 booklets in the series, including one on riverine operations entitled Combat at Close Quarters. All of those commemoration booklets are available free to download at NHHC. We also have a limited number at our booth downstairs. So, Dr. Esmeralda.
Thank you, John, for that kind introduction. First of all, I'd like to give a shout out to my fellow Vietnam veterans. How many Vietnam veterans are in the audience tonight? Oh, quite a few. Great. Well, I'm in good company. How many of you served on the rivers, or in country, I should say? Well, a good number too. Well, it's a pleasure to be here this evening, and I'm honored to be on the same panel with distinguished Fred McDavitt, and unfortunately Chet Smith couldn't make it, but I'm certainly honored to be, on the same panel as he. My talk today, I'm going to give an overview of the U.S. Navy in-country riverine operations, not specifically River Section 531, but a bigger picture. The first thing that comes up, and I hear this all the time from folks that I speak to, why was the Navy in Vietnam? How'd that come about? Well, it wasn't an easy thing. And in the early days, there was much opposition by Navy Central in the Pentagon to deploying any kind of forces in country. The thinking was, that's an Army or Marine bailiwick. We don't need to be in there. Horacio Rivero, who was the Vice Chief of Naval Operations in '64 or so, put out a memo at one time saying the Navy will not get involved in muddy water warfare. And that held. That was the thinking. In fact, it lasted even 65 through 68. It was still the thinking by many folks in the Navy. inspiration, really, or the driving force to get the Navy in country was from General Westmoreland, Commander U.S. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam. He said, "I need help. The South Vietnamese are not cutting it in the Mekong Delta. You've got 3 ARVN divisions there. You've got the river force, the Vietnam Navy. It's not enough. So I need you guys to help out." So he was the spark for that. It was the logical place, however, for the Navy to be. Here's a map of the Mekong Delta, some 3,000 miles of waterways, canals, rivers, all kinds of water courses. Route 4 was the only main road in the Delta. That was it. So water was very important for transportation, for commerce, for all kinds of activity. The Mekong Delta, of course, was the Rice Bowl of South Vietnam. It probably still is. A very fertile area. Home to 50% of the South Vietnamese population at that point. In another area that you can see to the upper right side, and I'll use my pointer, this is the so-called Rung Sat Special Zone. Here's a vessel of the Vietnam Navy. It's an old French, called it a Stacon foam. Not very powerful. It doesn't even look powerful. It looks like a little pleasure boat. So they had some pretty poor equipment that they had to operate with. Here's the Rung Sat, and it's actually, looks like the river on the left goes directly to Saigon. Well, that's not the one you would take. The more navigable waterway was the Long Tao, which goes right through the middle of that swampy mangrove area. 45 miles of circuitous route to Saigon, but absolutely critical because Saigon was the enter port for all the stuff coming in for our military in the southern areas of South Vietnam. And so one of the things that I want to mention in a larger sense is the work done by Mine Squadron 11. Those guys fought long and hard to keep that route open. You had minesweeping boats, and a number of them were sunk, guys were killed. You had the Coast Guard was in there with some of their cutters. You had, of course, river patrol boats, PBRs. And at one point in 1966, in Operation Jack Stay, the U.S. Marine Corps took part in a sweep of the Rung Sat. That was the only one time they really came south, but this was very important. It took the whole war to finally secure that route. We had merchant ships that were sunk. We had lots of smaller boats, the same thing happened to them. But the main point here is the route was maintained, it was kept open, the supplies kept going. The other main activity, and I think most of you who are in the rivers are associated with that, the River Patrol Force, Task Force 116, carrying out Operation Game Warden. Just a couple of, here's the result of a PBR that ran afoul of a mine. Fiberglass hull, doesn't take much to cause that damage. Here's your standard river patrol boat. And I always mix up my Mark 1s with my Mark 2s. I'm sure you guys know the difference, but either 31 feet or 32 feet. And this was your main preoccupation, especially in the early days, checking sampans, checking papers on the major rivers in the Mekong Delta. It was established in the end of 1966. The main rivers included the Basak and the 3 main tributaries of the Mekong River, which all flowed in from Cambodia. Critical to the work of the River Patrol Force in Operation Game Warden, and I know there's some of you out here because I sat with one of you at the bar just before tonight's program. That's it. Helicopter Attack Light Squadron 3, the Sea Wolves. Absolutely critical to what was done on the rivers because the waterways are narrow, the canals are narrow, you had foliage, came right down to the water. It would have been suicide without air support. HAL 3 provided that throughout the war. Really instrumental in our doing anything successfully. Another were later on, they decided we needed a little bit faster aircraft to get in there and be on call and get out to an operational area within 20, 25 minutes. So they brought in fixed-wing OV-10 Broncos, the black ponies, they're called. And they were equally powerful and really appreciated by the folks on the water. And last, certainly not least, SEALs, Navy Special Operations Forces. The SEAL community really cut their teeth. That was their birthplace, Vietnam. They were created for around the world, but they really were focused on Vietnam throughout the war. Worth their weight in gold, gathering intelligence, taking out enemy leaders, working with the South Vietnamese provincial troops and the rest. So these were all involved in the water operations, river operations. Another aspect of this, and I don't want to forget, the folks, you guys that served in the Mekong Delta, there were others who served up in the northern parts of South Vietnam, Operation Clearwater. And that was on the Qua Viet River, right next to the DMZ. As you know, the North Vietnamese Army was just north of that river and really wanted to contest our passage. But to keep the Marines at Con Tien and the Rock Pile and other places supplied, the Qua Viet had to be kept open. So PBRs were sent up there, some of the Mobile Riverine Force heavier units as well. The same thing with the river to Hue, the Perfume River. During Tet 1968, when there was absolutely heavy fighting in Hue, the Navy kept that route open to bring supplies in up the river. Two critical aspects of that. I mentioned that General Westmoreland was dissatisfied with the ARVN activities in the Mekong Delta. Well, he wanted to do even more. He said, you know, we're relying on these 3 South Vietnamese divisions, infantry divisions. They need some help. So he had established the U.S. 9th Infantry Division, which is a division he had served in as an artillery battalion commander in World War II, and then I think chief of staff of the division. So that he was favorable to that division being deployed to the Mekong Delta. They were paired with a Navy force, the Riverine Assault Force, Task Force 117. So you had 115 was the Coastal Patrol, 116 was the Game Warden, Riverine, River, and then 117 for the heavy hitting. Now the Riverine Force, I mentioned the combination of the Army guys, the 2nd Brigade of the 9th Division, and the Navy's Riverine Assault Force with monitors, armored troop carriers, assault support patrol boats, I mean, all manner of river craft, heavily armored and heavily armed. Now, these guys are not to go out and check sampans or to patrol segments of the river. They're out to kick butt. And all of you probably know General Westmoreland's big thing was search and destroy. He was fighting, in his mind, a war of attrition. We've got to kill more of the enemy than they kill of us. So that's what the MRF was out for. They were out to be the waterside segment of a surround. If you located a Viet Cong unit, we would take over the riverside. The Army would either helicopter or walk in for the other sides, theoretically surround the enemy unit and beat up on it. Very effective in 1967. The MRF took a heavy toll of the enemy. The enemy took a heavy toll of our guys as well, and the South Vietnamese who fought with us. But they were especially instrumental, and John Sherwood covers this in his War in the Shallows, Tet 1968. And the term is under suspicion by me, actually. They supposedly saved the Delta. I haven't been able to track down who actually said that statement, but it's been put to the MRF that they helped recapture My To, Long Vinh, Ben Tre, and other population centers that the enemy had overrun. They took them back with the Army troops and with the Riverine Assault Force. So critical to that operation. Here's a PBR. This is going back a bit, unloading on one of the banks of the riverway. Here's a HAL-3 helicopter, and you can see they're overhead, close at hand, ready to do their thing. Miniguns, M60 machine guns, rockets, heavily armed, ready go to work. Here's a seal. I love this painting. It's a representation, but I think it's pretty colorful. And we're talking about 531 this evening, and this is Boatswain's Mate First Class James Williams, Medal of Honor recipient for his work in 1966. I mean, if you read the citation, it's just phenomenal. They discovered some Viet Cong were unloading supplies in the river. He went charging in, shot the place up. He and one other boat. He had 2 PBRs. They went right through. RPGs were going all over them. They were, being shot at, but they were taking a heavy toll of the enemy. Well, he got to the other end. Rather than staying there, he turned around, came back again. So this went on for 2 or 3 hours, the entire engagement. Finally, air support came in, and he and the air support knocked out some 50 Viet Cong sampans loaded with supplies. Soldiers were killed on the banks. I like this picture because he's the most unlikely looking hero, but he definitely was a hero. And President Johnson, when he put the Medal of Honor ribbon around his neck, made some comment like, "Wow, you're a thick-necked sailor." But here's the battleship of the Mobile Riverine Force. This is a monitor. It's an old LCM, landing craft medium, from even World War II, which they just armored the whole thing, put guns, 40 millimeter, 60s and the rest. Here's a flame-throwing boat. And it was, it sounds pretty nasty, but really the object was to clear the vegetation away from the banks so the enemy couldn't hide there or build bunkers on the side. They'd be exposed. That's called a Zippo boat. And us Vietnam veterans know Zippo lighters. Here's a typical in the river, and the Mobile Riverine Force had a whole bevy of support ships, repair ships, berthing and messing ships to support their activity. And that support group, went with the MRF up the rivers as they went up looking for the enemy. Really critical. And you can see the armored troop carriers nesting, and it was very convenient. The soldiers loved the support ships because they came out of the paddies where they'd been in the rice paddies for 2 or 3 days. You all remember trench foot from World War I? Well, in Vietnam it was called immersion foot. Their feet were in water the whole time. They would come out of the water and their feet would be all shriveled up and diseases were rampant. They finally got a formula where they could only be in the field for like 2 days. They had to go back to the ship, hot showers, hot chow. So the soldiers really liked that. Here's some 9th Division troops, either coming or going. I'm not sure what they are, but they're heading out to the boonies. Not a pleasant place to be in the Mekong Delta. Here's the result. This is a Tet 1968 image, and the enemy got devastated. The Viet Cong came out of hiding and really took a hit that they never really recovered from. Hanoi had to send in North Vietnamese regulars to stiffen the forces in the Delta. And after 1968, the Delta actually was not the key fighting area. It was moving more to the north, although some here I'm sure would disagree. Here's Tom Kelly, another Medal of Honor recipient. He was with the MRF, and you can see the wound to his skull. I asked him to come into the Naval History Center at one point and give a talk. He did. It was a fine talk. He talked about the Navy in Vietnam. And at the end of it, I said, "Well, Tom, aren't you going to tell us about the action in which you got the Medal of Honor?" Well, he read his citation. He said, "That's all I can do. I do not remember what happened." So he got badly injured, but was brave. He kept trying to run the battle, even when he was badly injured, and he got his men through it. The key person in Vietnam fell on the right, Admiral Elmo R. Zumwalt, Jr., and to his left, General Creighton Abrams, who was commander of U.S. Military Assistance Command Vietnam. Elmo Zumwalt was clearly the most notable naval figure in the Vietnam War. He's most remembered. He went on to be Chief of Naval Operations after his time in Vietnam. He made a difference. When he came in, he built on the work done by you guys who were in the River Patrol Force up through '68, but he launched his Operation Sea Lords, and the object was to put patrolled barriers along the Cambodian border to stop some of that stuff that was coming in from Cambodia, from the Cambodian port of Sihanoukville, I should add, in supposedly neutral Cambodia. Prince Sihanouk was allowing Chinese ships to come into the port, offload. Cambodian trucking companies were paid off to carry the stuff right to the border, hand it over to the Viet Cong. So Zumwalt set up these border patrols, very effective, and the fighting was very heavy afterward because the enemy realized they had to break through here. They weren't very good at that. Before I go to that, another aspect of his was this Vietnamization program was the overall, turning the war over to the Vietnamese. The Navy called it ACTOV, Accelerated Turnover to the Vietnamese, same thing. My view, not as successful here as he was with Operation Sea Lords. In fact, I'm writing about it now. The South Vietnamese, he only had a few years to get the South Vietnamese ready to operate very heavy equipment, ships, Coast Guard cutters, destroyer escorts, and all the logistics system. And their Navy doubled in size in that period. Too much. They just could not handle it. So it didn't work. But he gave it a college try, and he really was innovative in the way he did it. Now, the war tended to move beyond the Mekong Delta after Zumwalt's time because the enemy was driven back into Cambodia. Once we went into Cambodia, pushed them back, and the war was changing. It was no longer guerrillas fighting. It was more up north where you had North Vietnamese conventional forces, tanks, heavy artillery, and the rest. So to the very end of the war, the Mekong Delta was held by the South Vietnamese, where they lost everything else north of Saigon. And the Easter Offensive. Now that, because things were so well settled in the Mekong Delta in 1972, when the North Vietnamese launched their attacks north of Saigon, toward Saigon, the Allies were able to dispatch a South Vietnamese infantry division up to north of Saigon to help out. So they didn't have to worry about the Delta behind them. Okay, as we know, we lost the war. So what was the effect of riverine operations in Vietnam? Well, I've got 4 things that I think speak to this. The riverine operations limited the enemy's strength in the Mekong Delta, which had been, that was their birthplace of the Viet Cong movement. It also significantly reduced the supplies coming in from Cambodia, especially after '68. It helped facilitate the Republic of Vietnam maintaining control of this critical area of their country. And it kept open the Long Tao River through the Rung Sat, the Perfume River, the Qua Viet, and certainly the Mekong River to Phnom Penh. Little postscript here. There was a convoy system from the South China Sea all the way up to Phnom Penh until 1975 that was enabled by Cambodian and South Vietnamese and U.S. naval forces. Ammunition and fuel kept going into Phnom Penh when everything else was in the charge of the Khmer Rouge. So river operations had their effect in a tactical sense. As you know, we lost the war, and the war was really, the major fighting was ashore with the Army and the Marine troops, but the Navy played its part for sure. John mentioned, I think, if you're interested in my little booklet, it's a PDF with the Naval History and Heritage Center, but also a GPO if you want to buy a copy of 80-page booklet, I guess it is. So, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Meraldo. That was a very interesting and illuminating talk. Our next speaker is Commander Fred McDavitt, United States Navy retired. Commander McDavitt was the first commander of River Section 531, based in My Tho, Vietnam. My Tho is a very significant town. It's the terminus of the Route 4, which is the only road going into the Delta. And it is also just downstream from what became the main base for the MRF, the Mobile Riverine Force, Dong Tam. He was commander of the PBR unit stationed at My Tho, River Section 531. Under his tenure, the River Section became one of the most highly decorated units in modern naval history, earning, among other awards, a Presidential Unit Citation and numerous individual awards, including 1 Medal of Honor, 2 Navy Crosses, 7 Silver Stars, and 26 Purple Hearts. The Medal of Honor recipient has already been mentioned. It's James Elliott Williams. We have a DDG named in his honor. One of the Navy Cross recipients was supposed to be here tonight, Chet Smith. So, Fred McDavitt.
Like old home week. When I first got here, I saw the pictures of Bosun Williams. It's the first one over here, and in the black and white. And then the picture beside him is Reuben Binder, who was his forward gunner. And there couldn't have been 2 more diverse people within touching range of each other, because Bosun Williams was from Darlington, South Carolina, and in the mid-50s and early 60s, that has a description all itself. He was everything you might think he would be. Reuben Binder was a Jewish kid from the Bronx, and they both took to each other like fire, or I'd say oil and water, and there was constant fighting going on. And I noticed when I'd go on patrol with Williams, he had a broom right next to the radios and the radar, and I said, "What is that for?" And he says, "Watch this," and he would take and poke Binder with it just to keep him going, you know. So, and it went from there. I would also like to acknowledge Admiral Jim Toole. He and I were very young in 1966. I was a frocked lieutenant. And he, as I remember, we had his wedding down party in Vung Tau for a lieutenant commander. So when it comes to young and inexperienced, we were it. Now, on the other end of that scale was Bosun Williams, who was 36 and on his twilight tour. And I might add, unlike Time magazine said, the PBR sailors are a, what did they say? Something to the effect of a band of, shall we say, brave volunteers, and I'm cleaning that up a little bit. Williams and several of the other bosun's mate first class we got didn't volunteer. Williams thought he was going to be master at arms at a barracks in Norfolk in his twilight tour. Surprise, surprise. Turned out to be very lucky for all of us, because he had also been in his earlier days, a coxswain on a Mike 6 going into Incheon Harbor for the invasion of Korea. So we had a very interesting crew, and we'll go from there. And now I'll start. Honored guests, members of the SNA board, distinguished flag officers, and fellow brown water sailors. And who are you guys? Excellent. It's a real honor to be here after, it was 50 years ago. I pretty much forgot all about this. And I got a letter from SNA saying, "Hey, you're the only guy that we know that may be dumb enough to come from California to Crystal City in November. We heard you'd go anywhere for a free meal, and here I am." So what I'm going to talk about tonight is the early days of riverine warfare, and in particular the founding of 531. And this is more of an admin brief, and Chet Miller, who unfortunately couldn't be here because he's stuck in a snow bank, was going to talk more about the combat end, so we'll see how much time we have. What I'm going to cover tonight will be in several subjects. The first will be our initial training, and the next one is what is a PBR. Then we're going to go is what is a river section, what kind of personnel did we have, dealing with the Viet Cong, and one of the most difficult tasks we had, which was establishing a curfew on the Mekong River from sundown to sunrise. Now you got to realize that for hundreds of years, the Vietnamese fishermen just ran the river anytime they wanted, and when you're going to tell them you can't do it when you really like to do it to get to market on time, a lot of interesting stuff. And lastly, I've got a photo. I think it's the only existing photo of most of the people in 531. Okay, 50 years ago, Admiral Toole and I show up at the Fib base along with about 250 other sailors. Oh, Time magazine called us an elite corps of volunteers. When you're my age, things like that cycle through and you got to say them when they show up. And we all checked in and said we are here for our PBR training, but more importantly, our riverine tactics training, and they said, we have no idea what you're talking about. Come back next week, sign in, we'll put you on basket leave, and we'll try to figure something out. So we came back the next week, and I don't know if you remember this, Admiral Toole, but they took the 6 of us who were going to be COs and a couple of the division commanders into a room, had long tables, and those tables were covered with training catalogs. And they said, here's the deal. Figure out what you think you ought to know. Sounds like modern day education. Figure out what you think you ought to know. See if there's a course on it, and we'll get you quotas to go, and that'll take another week or two to get that going on. Well, if a course only takes 30 people and you got 250 to get through the school, it's a good effort. So the first thing we had was small arms training. We thought that was important, and they sent us up to the Marines for 2 weeks at Camp Pendleton. It was called Camp San Onofre, and that was excellent training because if it was in Vietnam and you could pick it up, take it apart, put it back together, and shoot it, that's what we did. And we told them that we're going to do 50 caliber, a lot of 50 caliber work off of boats, and they said, well, we got no boats, but we got a 1.5 deuce flatbed, and they bolted a 50 caliber machine gun to it, and we went up and down the hills and got to shoot 55-gallon drums. Close enough. The next thing we wanted was jungle survival school. As you can see from my list there, we got desert survival school. Again, close enough. The course that we wanted next was survival swimming. We did get that. That was provided by the UDT school. That was, pre-SEAL. And that's where, if you haven't been through it, you start out in a bathing suit and in a swimming pool and end up swimming several miles in the open ocean with your full uniform, including boots. Literally, I near drowned doing that because we did it in February. Next, we wanted, and this is a requirement for anybody going into combat, code of conduct and POW conduct. You're supposed to have that before you go into combat, and they gave that to us, but it was all based on World War II and Korea era behavior of what we were supposed to do, and it couldn't have been any more wrong. They finally changed it, but the main difference was in World War II and Korea, they kept the prisoners in groups, usually of about 25 with a senior man. What did they do in Vietnam? isolated them, one man to a cell, and they would go months without seeing another American. Another story. Next, we wanted PBR, or small craft operations, but in particular PBRs, and of course there were none. And why did we want that? Because that was the first boat that the Navy was going to acquire that had jacuzzi water jets. And even the bosun's mates who had been driving small boats for 20 and 30 years had no idea what that was going to be like, and they wouldn't find out till they got to Vietnam. Then, of course, we wanted riverine warfare tactics, open book. You know, they handed me a notebook and said, fill this sucker up and hand it to us when you come back, and we'll get something going. Several courses that we got that were good. We got diesel engine maintenance. That was about a week, and fiberglass patching and repair, and that was good. And one of the funniest one was basic Vietnamese language, and that was provided by the Defense Language Institute at Monterey. And they sent down their only Vietnamese language instructor, Professor Beatus, who was also a reserve captain. In the career choices you make, this is not one that you would want, because she is now teaching Vietnamese to 250 essentially bosun's mates who really don't want to know very much. And once you got by, how much is a beer? Where is the restroom, which turns out to be anywhere, and how much for a short time, and that was the extent, that was the total extent of their language requirements. The rest of us suffered through the rest of that 2-week period learning all about how to speak about weapons in Vietnamese, but that's not what we really wanted to know. We didn't know it at the time, because we would operate in the same area of the river for years, and we needed to know, how's your mom, how are things going, are your new chickens growing and stuff like that, to sort of get their confidence. And we couldn't ask them anything except, have you got a machine gun? The answer was never no. Okay, another problem we had was uniforms and jungle boots, and the Marines felt so sorry for us that they issued all of their surplus winter utilities. The Marines don't have fatigues, they have utilities. And these suckers were so heavy that you could hardly pick them up, and then they also issued us jump boots, and all of those things pretty much rotted off of us when we got to Vietnam. But so much for that. I became obsessed with finding out what a PBR was. And you go to the training command and they can't even show you a picture, or no one even knows what you're talking about. People like me go berserk. So I called Uniflight up in Bellingham, Washington, and said, are there any other than in the factory? And they said no. But if you go to the San Diego Yacht Club, 3 people have bought them there, and you can go for a ride. So I did. And sure enough, I loved it, and I took a look at it, and there it was. Slept 6, had a head, had a galley, air-conditioned. What's not to like? You know what I mean? You paint it green, give everybody an M16, and you could be on your way. That's what I pictured. That was not to be. And here are the spec sheets from that, and this is 1966. This is the lowest model. The one you saw was the top model. And another thing I might mention, that you could get this beauty fully equipped for $12,000. Wait till you find out what we paid. Looks great. I pictured, this was going to be good living, even if it was on the river, and even if we were going to be shot at, you could take your chances. So when we finally got to Vietnam, and we ended up going to Vung Tau first, and then they took us out to an LSD called the Spiegel Grove, where they had offloaded 10 PBRs and had them in the well deck, and they were covered with canvas and then cosmoline, and then beside them was a Connex box, and I wondered what that was, and what that was the boat. The radar was in there, the radios were in there, the guns were in there, and we had to assemble it. Batteries were included. And so when we got it all put together and we decided we'd make one first, we had 10, and we would put one together first to see how hard it was, and we would try it out and see how it went. And you've seen a couple of pictures of what they look like when a couple of months or years down the road. Here's what the first ones look like. It had an armored turret and a twin 50. The 50s came from B-17s in Litchfield Park. It had an awning that stretched all the way over the entire open part of the boat. When we finally got an engineer from Bellingham, Washington out, I said, "What's with the awning?" Because you were totally blind. You couldn't look backwards. It was hard to see to the sides. And the turret was so big that you could see 20 degrees in front of you, and that was it, and you could see 180 degrees to the side of you, but essentially the coxswain was blind. And it was very heavy, and it kept the boat from getting on the step. In other words, it could never make the conversion from a displacement hull to a planing hull. So, I forgot to tell you the answers that the engineers gave me on the canopy. They said, keep the sun off, good. Keep the rain off, even better, big problem 6 months of the year. And it keeps the snakes who jump out of the trees onto you, off of you, and they'll slide over the side. And I told him, as far as I know, there are no jumping snakes. They may fall out of a tree, but they're not jumping. So the other thing that this had, the initial ones that showed up, were a 30 caliber machine gun in the aft part of the boat instead of a 50 caliber, and the 30 caliber was totally ineffectual. It would penetrate into the brush on the side of a riverbank somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 feet, where a 50 would go through it like butter. So the first thing we did was we requested to have 50s show up for the back of our boats, and they showed up pretty quick. Mr. Browning's finest achievement in my mind. So we took a vote, and we decided not to install the turret. Now you have to realize that the turret was ceramic armor, and the gunner couldn't see. And it was so heavy, the aircraft type bays, gun tubs if you will, had to be physically slewed, and they had brakes and you could stop them, but if it wasn't on brake mode and the coxswain turned really fast, that sucker just spun like a top. So, and with the armor, it was even worse. So the armor went, then we cut the canvas right here. And this shows you the inside of the gun tub right here. And the field of vision that the gunner had out of the turret was right here. And you can see where the coxswain wouldn't be able to see a thing. What you have here is a whole bunch of stuff to look at. This is the back two supports for this piece right here, which was the top of the turret. And when we would try to take them off, the folks in Saigon would say, you're messing with the design of the boat, and you've got to have all this on there. And our ultimate solution was we wouldn't have the side panels, but we would carry the top. We didn't use it, we just carried it. Now, this is classic for many things. Here is, if you're ready, brown water, as in the Brown Water Navy. And this is what we spent most of the day searching sampans and junks. And here is the lead boat where the searching is being done from, and this is the cover boat. Normally, this boat would be about 50 yards out here. But for photographic purposes, this came out of Life magazine. This was shot by Larry Burroughs, who was ultimately killed up north. This boat, we had to position here for him to get it. But this is what we did, and I'm going to give you, has another one for you to learn. This is a junk. This is a sampan. The difference is a junk has an internal motor. People can live on it. It has a water supply, as you can see right there, and it can carry a big cargo. A sampan is like an outboard motor. It's usually 18 to 20 feet long. They're very narrow and tend to tip over if you turn them too fast. There's another sampan. So lots in that picture. This is inside the Spiegel Grove when we took the boat out. This was the one that we built that had the turret on it. And what this pile of stuff here is, all of these cradles had wheels on them, and the folks on the ship decided that having 14,000-pound boats rolling around in their well deck might not be a good idea, and would we mind taking off the wheels, which we did, but they took their crane to pick them up and take them off. So the other thing you see here is we are long past our marine utilities, and all the crew guys are wearing dungarees. Okay. What we ended up with was this. You can see everything done to it, and of great significance here, this happens to be Chet Smith's boat, PBR 98, and his engineman is up there near the flag, engineman Cook, and his aftergunner, Sal Tallarico, is in the aft. And with a 50, they've taken the 30s off by then. And with a light load and half fuel tanks, these things could get up to about 30 knots, but under normal circumstances, 20 to 25 would be about as good as they could do. And which we found out from the engineers that the jacuzzi pumps, while very nice and keeping you able to run in about 9 inches of water when it was on the plane, 50% of the power generated by the engines was taken to run the pump, because it had to suck water up from the bottom, change direction 90 degrees, and then blow it out the back. So the pump itself was a big user of energy, and I guess they've have improved greatly on that design over the past 50 years. But the ones we had, the previous application was pro football locker room jacuzzi baths for the football players. That's where those pumps came from. We never got to see any football players. Okay. What did a PBR have in it? It was a hodgepodge. You had a commercial hull. You had guns from World War II bombers. The engines were V653 diesels, GM, that were in fact built for Greyhound buses. The radios were Korean War tank radios, VHF frequency range, and the radar was a Raytheon 1900N, which you could buy at any yacht store, commercial. It was a relative radar, and for those of you who don't know what that means that any direction you were going was north. But it was good for running in a river where you could see both banks. What was a river section? You had 10 PBRs. They were supposed to be sequential, but you can see from the ones we had, they were not. And one of the reasons was as the new PBR sections would come up the Mekong River to go to Vinlong and Sawdek and Long Chuen, if they had a bad boat in transit, we got it. They took one of our good ones, and then we fixed up the broken one. Personnel, we had 4 officers, supposedly an officer in charge or a CO, an ops officer, a maintenance officer, and a patrol officer. Seldom had all at the same time. We had 4 chiefs, and their job was to serve as patrol officers. And then we had 13 4-man crews, which included a boat captain, which was a petty officer first class, designated to be a bosun's mate, but they ran out of bosun's mates in a hurry. So Smith was a signalman. We had a radioman. We had a quartermaster. So if you were a first class petty officer and your heart was beating, you could be a boat captain. We had enginemen, and you would think that they would all be diesel enginemen, but in River Section 531, there was one diesel engineman, a very busy guy. We had other enginemen, but they weren't diesel mechanics. Forward gunners like Reuben Binder over here were all GMGs, gunner's mates, either seaman or third class. And then the after gunner was a non-rated seaman. Total of 60 people on the org chart, and we never reached ever full manning. What we really needed, and the people who designed the manning, I always wanted to talk to them. We never had an XO. That was supposed to be a duty for the ops officer in addition. We never had an admin officer, which is a real critical thing, and that was another duty, additional duty for the ops officer. We never had a yeoman, and that was a big job. And we never had a corpsman. Now, our section had a 60% casualty rate, and we never had a corpsman and couldn't get one. The only time we could get a corpsman is if they were doing a med cap where they would take a corpsman and a dentist and a doctor, and we would take them out to the various villages to do medical stuff for the Vietnamese. They could get a corpsman. We couldn't get one. Now, to give you an idea of what we looked at, my maintenance officer, I didn't have one for 3 months, and they had a hard time finding maintenance officers, so they had a program for about a year where they took first-class enginemen and promoted them directly to WO1, and that's what I got one of. The leaving out of the XO, admin officer, and yeoman was a stroke of genius from Brieux-Pur's standpoint, but they never had a concomitant reduction of requirements of paperwork. It remained the same. There was never a change. And finally, it came to a head when FIBPAC sent 2 captains out to do an admin inspection. And when the helo was landing, I said, "What are you guys here for?" And they said, "We're here to give you an admin inspection." And I told the warrant running the helicopter, "Keep it going, because there is no reason for these people to be here." But they were able to talk me into letting them come over and see what was going on. So they agreed that it was stupid, but they were staying anyway because they wanted to get combat pay. And what they would do, it was a standard thing. You came the last week of 1 month and stayed the first week of the second month and got 2 months combat pay. The fact you didn't accomplish anything didn't matter. So about 6 weeks later, there's a beep at our front gate, and there's a deuce and a half, and in there are desks, file cabinets, typewriters, every publication you've ever seen, no corrections entered, and 2 yeomen. My yeoman's name was Gabe DeVries, and I noticed in his record that he had 4 tours, and he was a YN SN, So I knew there was a story there. Admiral Toole's yeoman's name was Peter Kohler Fotenhauer, and that took two complete pockets to get that name across there. And he was a good yeoman. Now, on the interesting side of the yeoman world, they all wanted to go on patrol, and Gabe DeVries, I took him out on a day patrol, and he was shot in the derriere by a sniper, and I couldn't stop the bleeding, and I finally sat him down on the engine cover, which stopped the bleeding, and he was evacuated to the States, which was probably his worst fear, because he had married 2 women and was engaged to a third. Admiral Toole's yeoman, Peter Kohler Fotenhauer, was going on in fact, he was leading a convoy to Saigon, because they didn't like coming down where we were, and got shot in the head, but the bullet was at the end of its run, and it went into his helmet and went around about 3 or 4 times and dropped in his lap, but it looked like you took a straight pin and ran it around his head because he was bleeding, he thought he was dead. And he did stay, but it was interesting. And I finally got an ops officer for about 3 months. And he was evacuated after wounding himself in his private parts, and I won't go any further with that. And he never came back. And one of the funniest things, I went up to Saigon to see him in the hospital, and they had his private parts in traction. And and he said, the worst thing I hate is Admiral Ward comes through every day and tries to pin a Purple Heart on my pillow, and I keep saying, go away, I don't want it, don't want anybody, anyway. So it was a difficult time at best, and as I said, personnel-wise, we never were at full complement. Now, one of the things we did, which was considered to be unusual at the time and way out of line, an area where I lived a lot of my time in the Navy, was I noticed after being in a couple of firefights that some folks are really good at it and some folks suck. And I was sort of in group 2. And so I said, what are the common denominators? What do you look for people who are really good in combat? And it is their ability to react after it starts. Now, if you are on an offensive ambush, it's like you were a kid in the backyard and you've got cap guns, or you've got real guns in this case, but the bad guys have got cap guns and you're in charge. But when you get ambushed at night, it's a whole different world. You don't know what excitement is until all you can see is white flashes and tracers coming at you. Well, everybody for a few seconds goes blank because you can't believe that some son of a bitch you don't even know is trying to kill you, and for no good reason that you knew of at the moment. So the people who are good at it are quick to recover. And when they are quick to recover, they can rally the rest of the troops. Some people never recover. Some people, if you ever remember Saving Private Ryan, at the beginning of the movie, they have a guy in combat who runs up a stairway and hides up there when combat starts, and they essentially send him home. That happens. We had it happen twice. But the people who can react the quickest and rally the troops can turn a fight around in seconds. For reasons I don't know, people react to say, come on, let's go. Williams was genius at it. But again, he was 36 and the rest of us were quite young. And I found that the younger the people were, the more likely they were to be affected in a firefight as far as fear goes. So I decided that I would make a program with, and I might add, Admiral Toole's blessing, to qualify certain of my first-class bosun's mates or signalmen or quartermasters as PBR patrol officers, which was normally a commissioned officer or a chief, if they could pass a series of tests and win the confidence of the other officers, in this case me. And it worked quite well, and we had 3 of them. And as Chet Smith would tell you, there's no days in the week that a guy on the signal bridge can dream that somebody's going to come up and say, hey, have I got a deal for you? How would you like to lead men in combat, you skivvy waving sucker, you? So, and in the Navy, that doesn't happen. We don't give folks the chance to operate out of their comfort zone, and that's really out of your comfort zone. Well, fortunately, that caught on. I've just been told that he's going to get the hook. So anyway, that caught on, and that happened throughout the PBR force for the rest of the time it was over there. I'm going to go fast. Fasten your seatbelts. This is River Section 531 coming up the Mekong River into Mito. Classic picture. When we got to the point where we were moving off of the piers of the Vietnamese Navy in Mito and building our own piers, which was like 6 months after we were there, we had some visitors, and this picture and this picture were captured from Viet Cong by the U.S. Army. And these were taken with a camera called the Minolta 16, which I understand is quite small. And they were setting us up for something, and what they were setting us up for was they were going to float mines down on us. And they started doing that by using coconuts. First time, a whole bunch of coconuts, and then onesies and twosies and what have you. And we ended up having the Seabees come in and make a mine net. Now, you wouldn't think that anybody would bother mining a 31-foot plastic boat, but if you don't aim high, that's what you end up doing. They changed our name all the time. We went from River Division 531, and that's what I was ordered in as. They changed it to River Section, then River Patrol Section, because that's what we did. We patrolled. Then back to River Section when they started moving the boats around on the LSTs and the floating barracks, and they started moving them around, and we were no longer assigned to patrol a specific area. And then finally, in late '68, they changed the name back to River Division. Kept somebody busy in the Pentagon, probably a whole year at a time. What will we change it to this week? This is a very famous picture. There is, right here at 6'6", Chet Smith, who's not here, who got the Navy Cross. And that's my whole section through there. This is Bosun Williams, and this is me in what I like to call my sleek and racy days. And this is a caricature drawing that was done by a caricature artist named Rick Romeo, and that was supposed to be me. And you might ask, why the cigar? Well, we used to escort the San Miguel Brewery coastwise steamer out of Manila, and it would go up the Mekong River to Phnom Penh. And we would escort as it went through our various areas, and as it came back down, if it wasn't attacked, it would near sink our patrol boats that were near it with beer and Philippines San Miguel beer, which I might add, and it's very good if you've never had any, and and Philippine cigars called Tabacaleros Coronas Largas. And for me, they were about that long, and for about the first 10 minutes, it was a question of who was smoking who. So, And that's the end of my drill, so what I'm going to do here is leave you with two riverine, I guess you could say mottos or sayings that you might want to write down, and you can have them engraved in a plaque. The first one is, no matter how fast you think your boat is, it's not going to outrun a bullet. And the second one is, if you're ambushed, no matter how much ammunition you have with you, it's not going to be enough. And that's it, folks.
Thank you, Fred. I'm going to be very quick in describing the Vietnam experience of Chet Smith. Chet retired as a captain, but in the Vietnam War, he was a signalman first class. He came from Western Ohio, Salina, Ohio, and he was, quote unquote, more interested in seeing the world than going to school. So what did he do? In 1954, he joined the Navy at the age of 18. After boot camp, he entered Radioman A school, but he dropped out. And why did he drop out? Because I did not join the Navy to go to school, okay? So what did the Navy do? They sent him to auxiliaries to chip paint, literally. He did that for a while, and he finally landed on a radar picket escort from 1956 to 1959. He struck for the signalman rating because he loved being outside. Maybe that was from his experience working on the deck. Other ships he served on were the Hugh Purvis, DD-709, and the auxiliary fleet tug Sunadin. And tugboats are not known for their smooth ride in rough seas, so that's where he got some nice ocean-going experience in a relatively small boat. Smith was not voluntold to go to Vietnam. He volunteered. And he volunteered not because he wanted to go to Vietnam, but because he detested the idea of a shore assignment. He became a plank owner for River Section 531. Fred McDavitt described Smith as he was a quiet guy, but I could see the intensity burning in his eyes. But McDavitt hesitated at first in appointing Smith as a boat captain because of his rating. The shortage of boatswain's mates ultimately compelled him to take a look at other ratings, and Smith stood out because of his seagoing experience and his aggressive attitude. He spent several months in a cover boat as the boat captain in a two-boat patrol, and he eventually passed all tests and hurdles required for the role of patrol officer position. Yeah, officer. He was a first class, and this is really a position for an officer. These patrol officers, and to a certain degree boat captains, had agency. They had the ability to interpret rules of engagement, make use of force decisions. Lives were in their hands. This was a big deal in the Vietnam War, the idea of giving a first-class petty officer this level of combat command. He and Smith were the first, and Williams were the first, he became the only first-class petty officer of the unit besides Smith to achieve the patrol officer position, the two-boat leadership position. Smith received his Navy Cross on a mission on 11 December 1966 as a patrol officer of a two-boat patrol. He pursued a sampan with several Viet Cong down one of these small canals, and he received fire not only from this sampan but from Viet Cong along the banks. He promptly directed his crew to return fire. Now, in theory, the mission of the PBR was to patrol the main rivers, so the 4 main rivers, the Bosok and the 3 branches of the Mekong, to check papers, look for contraband, enforce the curfew. The mission wasn't direct action, but McDavitt told his sailors that if there was an opportunity to engage the enemy, even if it meant going up a small canal, which was dangerous because the only way out was to back out, and because of high banks, it was difficult with gun angles and whatnot. But if you felt as a patrol officer that you could succeed in such an endeavor, you could engage in direct action with a combat force. And don't forget, the PBR was fiberglass. It was essentially non-armored. The gun tub was armored. There was a little bit of armor around the pilot house, but it was essentially unarmored. Smith not only went down that canal once, but he did it twice. He actually did it 3 times, thinking that he wouldn't be expected to return. When he did return, he found 40 sampans and a company-sized Viet Cong force preparing for a river crossing, and Smith attacked. He came back, attacked again. Then what did he do? He called in the helicopters, HAL 3. HAL 3 was intimately involved with these operations. Often helicopters created the most casualties. They had the firepower. They had firepower and mobility that riverine forces didn't have. But the 2 working hand in hand were extremely successful. The net result of this action was 15 Viet Cong killed, 28 sampans sunk, 12 damaged, 3 captured during the engagement. Next to Williams's action, it's one of the most significant actions performed by River Section 531. The next day, General Westmoreland, who was Military Assistance Command Vietnam at the time, wrote a message to Admiral Ward, who was ComNav for V, and he said, quote unquote, PBRs 98 and 106 were right on the job on the morning of 11 December, resulting in a fine victory against the enemy at Din Tong. Attack by PBRs and light fire team disrupted large VC force and was an outstanding example of success of game warden. Please pass on my hearty congratulations to all concerned. Westmoreland sends. I'd like to thank everybody for attending Heritage Night. I'll allow some time right now for Captain Alder to say a few words, then we'll have a brief Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sherwood, Dr. Maralda, and Commander McDavitt. Dr. Maralda, thank you for your overview. Dr. Sherwood for pulling this together, and Commander McDavitt for your briefing, which was excellent. And we're really honored to be in your presence tonight. I really appreciate you traveling out here in the cold, and you arrived in the very cold this Saturday, although it's mild today. But we appreciate you coming out here, and it was a very nice presentation. On behalf of the Surface Navy Association, we'd like to present Dr. Maralda with a plaque, please.
Thank you. Very nice.
Good photography it is. And Commander McDavitt, we'd like to present you also with a plaque. Appreciation for coming out tonight. Your service. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Okay, now if we want to entertain a few Q&A, please just stand up and state your question, and we'll see what we can do. Sir.
On the edge of my seat, wondering, Commander McDavitt said it was $12,000 to buy the PBR. Virtually, I can only imagine with
$76,000 apiece. I do want to say one other thing about Chet Smith that he was going to say, and I aim this at the more senior officers in the room, and that is the difficulty that these kids that had been patrol officers who had been in charge of tactics and calling in helicopters or 105 tubes for support and being sent back to the signal bridge on a ship. Wasn't an easy pill to swallow, and on the good side for Smith, it forced him into going into the LDO program, so just to get even, but that's another whole story. And on the other hand, Williams never ever got promoted above first class. He is still today the most decorated sailor in the United States Navy, and he never got promoted above first class. Sec Nav gave him an honorary promotion to chief and gave him an ID card that said he was a chief, but there was no money connected with it. And he never quite got over that, but that's another whole story.
Anyone else?
Did you ever do any transitions on that anti-gun transition into an M60 machine gun, or put any reinforcement in the back of those boats that included an M80 mortar for the patrols?
The PBR was a fascinating craft. I'm making up time here. In that we had twice as many weapons as we had people to shoot them. Now, the problem with that is that you've also got twice as much ammunition, which adds to the weight. You had the twin 50s forward, a single 50 aft. Eventually, within a few months, we had, I think it was an M70 machine gun amidships, which we had nobody to shoot, and a 40 millimeter grenade launcher, also amidships, which we had nobody to shoot. And then we also carried 4 M16s, an M79 grenade launcher, and my favorite, a 12-gauge shotgun, a Remington Parkerized pump that could take 5 shells in the magazine and 1 in the chamber, and they were so overpowered, or so much powder in them, that they had to make them with brass shells. And you could do some really bad stuff with that shotgun. And you need to realize that in many of the fights that PBR sailors got in, we're not talking miles away, folks. We're talking as close as you are, looking them in the eye. This is a whole different kind of warfare for the Navy, and probably the only people that deal with it on a daily basis are SEALs. But here you had raggedy-ass sailors coming out of PBR school, and they just thought it was a lot of fun just to shoot people, but that's another whole story. So it's a very different group of people, and there were some very famous folks who came out of that group, and both good and bad. So that's about it. Yes.
How did it all come to an end?
I don't understand your question.
You had your period of engagement at the Delta. When finally did it end, and when did you turn it over to the South Vietnamese? How long was that?
The turnover, most of the boats were turned over in 1969, 1970. By the end of 1970, all the boats were in the hands of the Vietnam Navy. And the way they did the process, you would take on board, in the Vietnamization program, you take on board a Vietnamese sailor on the crew, and then 2 Vietnamese sailors, 3 Vietnamese sailors, ultimately the boat commander, and then the division commander would be Vietnamese. So it was an evolutionary process. What I've read is that it worked well when you just had sailors, but when the Vietnamese officer took over, the patrol frequency went way down, and their willingness to take aggressive action went way down. So by 1971, when most of the American troops of all sorts were out, the Vietnamese had the con. In the Delta, it didn't make too much difference because, as I mentioned earlier, the war kind of shifted to the north. But everything I've read from both the American and the Vietnamese side was Vietnamization did not go very well in the Delta region. And at the end of the war, of course, the North Vietnamese invaded from the north, and they came all the way down and took Saigon. The Mekong Delta was considered a backwater at that point, so nobody needed to take it. The enemy didn't need to take it. So it was never occupied until the final surrender.
No, and that's why it was called an ambush. We didn't know they were going to have an ambush, and they didn't know when we were going to do it. So no, there was no no GPS. Here's one for you folks. We didn't even have maps. The last map that they had was published in 1939 by the French. And myself and my patrol officer, a guy named Charlie Varellis, got into an Army helicopter and flew up and down our 40-mile stretch, took pictures with our 35-millimeter cameras, had them developed, pasted them together, took tracing paper, and made handmade maps of our river area. And, and then we sent a copy to the mapping agency in Washington, and I forget their name, and we said, by the way, these things are going to get wet and soggy, so please print them on something that'll, repel water. Well, what they sent us was sort of stretchable, and you could change the map size by. They finally did do it right, but it was after I was gone. So nobody asked me about the Black Beret, which was another feature of the Brown Water Navy, in particular Task Force 116. And anybody who was attached to 116 permanently or temporarily, like HAL 3 or the Minesweep folks or other groups that would come in, were able to wear a black beret, and there's a long story that goes with that. That's what the Vietnamese River Patrol people wore, and it came with a long ribbon down the back. And when you got your first firefight, you could chop off the long ribbon, and that's how you knew who was a big dog and who was not. And it was a constant fight. And I can say that Admiral Toole backed us up all the time because we wore them all the time. And finally, Commander Task Force 116, at that time I believe it was Burt Witham, in 1967 came out with a message and said, okay, I might as well authorize it because your guys are wearing them anyway. So we were only allowed to wear them on patrol or around our base, but occasionally folks would sneak up to Saigon with them, and there would be people, Navy folks, trying to run these guys down and find out where they were from. So that's the Black Beret.
One more, sir.
I'm the Hal Free guy. I want to add to his story there. We didn't have maps either. To become a gunship pilot, aircraft commander, we had to memorize the whole delta. So we knew where the AO was, where all his riverine guys were. That story. And secondly, we wore the Black Beret also, and when we got in our first firefight, we had a ceremony and we were snipped off. And also, when you had the first flechette firefight, you guys know what the flechettes are, right? The rockets that sent the very bad things out. You could then wear in your beret crossed flechettes. I have one too. I worked for him when he was brand new.
Okay. Thank you very much again, gentlemen, for your time tonight and for all the guests for joining us. Thank you very much.